Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening. Welcome to the show. Here's what's coming up tonight on Credlin. It is a busy show. Big news tonight out of Israel, with the cabinet agreeing to a deal that will see the release of around 50 Israeli hostages by Hamas in exchange for the release of 150 Palestinian prisoners in jail in Israel. Reports are that women and children are those likely to be released, but that's not much more than a quarter of the Israelis held hostage in Gaza. All the details coming up with the Australian's foreign editor, Greg Sheridan. More revelations today about ongoing foreign criminals fiasco. The New South Wales Attorney-General says he's got no idea about the criminals in New South Wales. He says he hasn't been briefed by police, while the Federal Home Affairs Minister, well, she doesn't know who's been fitted with ankle bracelets, at the same time as the WA Police Chief says he's got 4 sex offenders roaming free with no bracelets at all. More on this mess in just a moment. Plus, I'll be joined by former PM Tony Abbott for his take on Anthony Albanese's evasive comments over those obvious Chinese hostilities to our divers. And the shock announcement late this afternoon from Foreign Minister Penny Wong that Australia has granted over 840 visas to Palestinians in Gaza, with serious questions raised about the government's security assessment process.
People are subjected to appropriate security checks. I would again say this. People who obtain visas to Australia are subject to appropriate security checks. People who obtain Australian visas are subject to appropriate security checks.
I will come back to that issue, but first, sometimes you've got to wonder whether anyone is actually in charge of what happens in this country. Last week, as you know, the High Court overturned a decades-old precedent and ruled that foreigners who'd committed serious crimes couldn't be kept indefinitely in immigration detention, meaning that the worst of the worst that their own countries don't want back would be set free onto the streets and suburbs of Australia. Despite a warning from the court this change might be looming back in June, the Albanese government, from the Prime Minister down, were asleep at the wheel on national security. Initially, the Home Affairs Minister, Claire O'Neill, said that there was nothing the government could do, nothing they could do about the release into the community of some 80 convicted criminals, murderers, rapists, pedophiles, because she insisted you can't out-legislate the High Court.
The idea that it is open to the Australian government to simply legislate away a High Court decision is not how our Constitution works.
But the outcry was such that the very next day she did introduce legislation that she boasted was incredibly tough.
The person on the leader of the opposition loves to present himself as a tough guy on the borders. He never wrote laws as tough as this, Speaker. He never wrote laws as tough as this.
Yep, Minister, so tough it lasted about 2 hours before the government was begging the opposition to help them amend it, because the minister's so tough draft didn't have any security measures to protect the community from these criminals. No warnings for victims, no rules to keep them away from working with children, no rules to require the wearing of an ankle bracelet so the police at least would know where they were. Now, if you thought that wasn't bad enough, well, wait for this, because today we discover that the requirement to wear the ankle bracelet isn't even being properly enforced. Despite the new laws being passed last Thursday, on Monday, the West Australian Police Commissioner said that 4 sex offenders had been released from immigration detention in that state, but had remained without any security bracelets.
No, we don't have the authority to monitor people who are lawfully in our community. There's only 4 reportable offenders that we are responsible for to monitor under very stringent conditions, and if they breach their reporting obligations, then we can charge them with an offence and hopefully get them locked back up.
Right.
That's our plan. Right. For those.
They're not, these 4 that you're talking about, they're not under GPS trackers right now.
They're not under GPS trackers.
Yet on Breakfast Television today, the Minister in charge, Claire O'Neill, well, she did not know whether those released sex offenders were wearing ankle bracelets 36 hours after the Commissioner just said they were not. Have a listen.
Everyone who has been released from detention has been placed on the new visa arrangements, and Minister Giles is doing a good job of operationalising that scheme at the moment.
OK, so the ankle bracelets are on, the curfews are in place.
Yep.
Okay.
So the ankle bracelets and the curfews are being rolled out at the moment, Carl.
There's a difference between being rolled out and the ankle bracelets are on, though. Are they on?
So I'll let Minister Giles speak to that. I certainly know that many people have had those curfews and ankle monitoring bracelets rolled out.
Now, just listen to that. She is the most senior Border Protection Minister in the country. And instead, she's just blathered and buck passed, blaming her junior minister, Andrew Giles, saying basically it's his job, not hers, to consider each of these cases on an individual basis. Now, if he has, and that's a big if, he's either decided that convicted sex offenders should not have bracelets, or he hasn't managed to convey that decision, that they should, to the WA police. Now, maybe he hasn't even made a decision. Given his form today, perhaps the papers are still sitting on his desk. But it gets worse. Also today, the New South Wales Attorney General, so the state's top law officer, Michael Daly, could not say, when quizzed about it on Sydney radio, whether released foreign criminals in New South Wales were too wearing bracelets.
Look, as you say, Mark, that's a federal matter. I haven't had a briefing on that, but I trust that the authorities of the state and federal level would do a very, very good job of tracking offenders.
But we've got detainees in New South Wales, do we not?
Well, we have detainees in New South Wales coming out of the New South Wales prison system that are surveilled, if you like, by corrections officers, and they do a terrific job.
And you haven't been briefed?
On the federal aspect of it, no, that's a matter for the police to do.
Now, when pushed, Daly said that keeping tabs on these released foreign criminals wasn't his job. It was a job, he said, for police to deal with.
But you're telling me the Attorney General, the top lawmaker in New South Wales, has not been briefed by his federal counterparts? No,
that would be a matter for the police and corrections to deal with that. The Attorneys General don't deal with surveillance of offenders on the streets once they've been through the court system.
Now, honestly, you couldn't make this stuff up. If it was a plot in a movie, you'd say, look, that's just not plausible. But here we have the Home Affairs Minister at a federal level failing to take any notice of a judicial warning that foreign criminals might soon be out in the streets because she claimed that it was unlikely they would lose the case.
We were advised that it was likely that the Commonwealth would win the case, that is, allow us to do what we wanted to do, which is keep these people in detention.
How recently did you receive that advice?
Well, we received that advice from the Department of Home Affairs, who tell us what chances we have of success and failure in each legal case. But I do need you to understand that...
When did you receive that advice?
I do need you to understand that our department is one of the most litigated against departments of the Commonwealth.
Those lines she's running, they're utter rubbish. I mean, she must think I came down in the last shower. Then she said there was nothing she could do about it anyway.
To simply legislate away a High Court decision is not how our Constitution works.
That's right, you heard that. Then she said legislation was going to fix it all.
He never wrote laws as tough as this, Speaker. He never wrote laws as tough as this.
Then she said she didn't know that it had been fixed because it was actually someone else's job and that she hadn't been briefed on it anyway.
There's a difference between being rolled out and the ankle bracelets are on, though. Are they on?
So I'll let Minister Giles speak to that. I certainly know that many people have had those curfews and ankle monitoring bracelets rolled out.
And then to compound all of this official denial of reality and evasion of responsibility at a federal level, there's a replay of the same hand washing and a not my jobbery at a state level as well.
Look, as you say, Mark, that's a federal matter. I haven't had a briefing on that.
Honestly, why on earth do we even have elected ministers if all they do is wait to get briefed? They don't ask to get briefed, they wait to get briefed and then passively go along with whatever has been advised. And since when have elected, unelected and unaccountable officials been the people really in charge of our borders? And what's the point of them anyway? If the end result of all of this briefing and dithering and matters falling between different jurisdictions is that the law isn't enforced anyway and dangerous criminals are unmonitored on our streets. What's also come to light this afternoon after my colleague Andrew Clennell has picked up some detail is the backtracking from Claire O'Neill about her claim that officials told her that the government would not lose the High Court case, which explains, so her logic goes, why she had no plan B in the event that they would lose, which is exactly what happened.
We were advised that it was likely that the Commonwealth would win the case. We received that advice from the Department of Home Affairs, who tell us what chances we have of success and failure in each legal case.
But as Clennell reported earlier this afternoon, that's at odds with documents now released by the High Court that appear to suggest the federal government tried to cut a deal back in May to avoid the recent court case loss. And when pushed on this, today the Minister, she didn't repeat her earlier claim that her department told her she was going to win. Have a listen.
I was not referring to legal advice when I made comments about the Commonwealth's prospects in that case. I do not, will not ever talk about the legal advice that is provided to the Commonwealth. What I was referring to was operational and policy conversations that were happening with my department that we felt might change, potentially change the outcome of the case. Specifically, could we remove the complainant from the country and end the High Court decision?
Tripped up and now backtracking. Is it any wonder that voters are steadily losing faith in this government? Is it any wonder when people we elect don't seem to be in charge and when the people who are in charge don't seem capable of doing their jobs, telling us straight what's going on, and when they do stuff up, admitting their mistakes and fixing it all as best as they can? Now, clearly this is a government with ministers out of their depth, led by a Prime Minister who's out of the country and out of touch. All right, let's go to Canberra now for the headlines. Sky News political reporter Joel Philp.
Good evening. The federal government has welcomed news of an agreement between Israel and Hamas, which includes a 4-day ceasefire, the release of 53 Israeli hostages and 150 Palestinian women and teenage prisoners.
This is an important and necessary step, but what we must ultimately work towards is a long-term enduring peace. And I again reiterate that a long-term enduring peace requires a two-state solution.
Meanwhile, the reopening of Melbourne's Holocaust Museum has attracted dignitaries from across the country and political spectrum. There was a bipartisan show of support for the Jewish community.
Jewish Australians have been bearing a pain you should never have had to bear again.
We're witnessing an unmasking and a resurgence of the same hateful thoughts and behaviours which led to the Holocaust.
Bruce Lehrmann took the stand today on the first day of his trial, suing Network 10 and Lisa Wilkinson for defamation, while his case against the ABC has been settled out of court. The defamation lawsuit relates to a 2021 interview between Wilkinson and Brittany Higgins on Network 10's The Project, which contained accusations Miss Higgins was raped by a Liberal staffer in Parliament House, without naming the alleged attacker. Mr. Lehrmann's barrister argued it would not have been difficult for colleagues inside Parliament House to work out from the Project interview who the alleged perpetrator was, telling the court, "Our client comes here seeking vindication for the defamation that has utterly destroyed him." Network 10 is seeking to prove the contents of the interview and the allegations were substantially true. The government has struck a deal with the Australian Resources and Energy Employer Association to exempt service contractors from its IR legislation. It means the business community is now divided on its opposition to the reforms, increasing the likelihood they will pass the Senate. The Minerals Council of Australia still opposes the legislation and has been running a marketing campaign against it.
We're not going to do a deal for one part of the economy and leave everybody else out to dry on this issue.
I don't think there is any scenario where they end up supporting the bill. But, yeah, as people watch the millions and millions of dollars worth of ads over summer, I think a lot of Australians would be saying, why are you spending the money on ads rather than just paying your workers?
All right, lots to get through tonight. Joining me now for the latest, the Daily Telegraph's national editor, James Morrow, of course, at Sky News host, and our Northern Australia correspondent, our Darwin Bureau Chief, Matt Cunningham. Gentlemen, welcome. I won't go through the litany of issues, James, that I started there in relation to border protection. More calamity today about those foreign detainees and a lack of clarity from the New South Wales Attorney General right through to the Minister there, Claire O'Neill. But the government's bleeding on this, isn't it?
Well, they've got a huge problem here, Peter. I mean, let's put this in the context of more recent political history here in this country. You know, Labor governments have so often come unstuck with their management of borders, with detainees, with refugees, with people exactly like the 93 people who have been released here with or without ankle monitors, and the other 300 or 340 people who could also be released from detention, because fundamentally, you know, they don't believe in borders. I just think that, you know, you have to look at the way they act. They think that on some level, borders are bad. National sovereignty is just something that's a bit icky. And if people are here, they're here, and you can't really do anything about it. And, you know, it is not in line with community expectations. It's not in line with reason to have these people who are, for whatever reason, not be able to be sent back to their country. And I think there's some real issues that Australia and other countries are going to have to look at very soon about, you know, the way we manage some of these international conventions. But beyond that, though, that they don't know what's going on with these people or who they are, and that they've tried to manage this more as a media issue rather than as law enforcement and sovereignty issue, I think is absolutely disgraceful, Peter.
I'll come back to that issue a little bit later on, but you made a point there about international conventions. I am aware there's talk in South Africa that they are going to withdraw from the Refugee Convention for some of the issues that you just raised there, James. But Matt, I have to say, we learned this afternoon from Penny Wong the talk of 860-odd Palestinians being granted visas to come to Australia. Now, of course, you want to hope they're security checked, but the two clowns, the department heads that do the checking of anyone coming to Australia, are the same two ministers, Giles and O'Neill, can't even tell us if they've got ankle bracelets or not, or they don't know where the pedophiles are and where the murderers are. I mean, it doesn't inspire a lot of confidence, does it?
Yeah, I don't think I can articulate how poorly they've handled this issue better than you did in your introduction. I mean, they really are all over the shop, and they have been for more than a week now, and it really is doing the government serious damage. I think they need to sit down, they need to do their homework, and they need to make sure they're across all of the detail of this issue, because that's what Australians are expecting at the moment. I do agree with James's point at some level. This is always a difficult issue for Labor, and the reason it's a difficult issue for them often is because internally they don't necessarily agree on a hardline approach. You know, we know that Andrew Giles, who's the Immigration Minister, you know, back in 2015, he was arguing at the Labor conference against boat turnbacks. You know, for the coalition, this is easy. They're all on the one page. They believe that we need to be hard on this issue, but Labor internally, we know, are quite often divided when it comes to border protection.
Divided and soft, Matt, you got it in one. James, the RBA rate hikes, we know across the board, are being felt, particularly with families. We find today that a third of businesses are considering laying off workers before Christmas. That's a massive blow. We've got 1.2 million people out there saying they've had to delay medical appointments and they're delaying filling prescriptions because of rising costs. New figures from The Economist says that Australia is now behind Britain, Germany, Canada, US, France and others when it comes to beating inflation. And we see that polling, the coalition ahead of Labor. I think the electorate are now questioning not just the PM on national security, but also on the handling of the economy.
Well, that's right, Peter. And I think that it's a shame that a lot of Australians are looking forward to a really grim Christmas this year. You know, we've got not only that runaway inflation, but also we've seen figures showing that Australian household income went back 5.1% to practically GFC levels in the last financial year. People are really doing it tough, and this government here isn't making it any easier. You know, they like to talk a big game about we're targeting a subsidy here, we're doing that there, but so much of what they're doing is inflationary, and they're pumping more pain into the system, making more interest rates more likely. And these have to do with three things. They have to do with out-of-control government spending that's still not, you know, they say it's targeted, but it's still money in the economy. It's the renewable energy transition, which is far too fast and which is causing power bills and everything else to go through the roof. And, you know, it's also about this immigration issue where you're talking about 500,000, 600,000, 700,000 people a year. That is contributing about a third of that inflation, which is causing the RBA to have to look at more interest rate rises, which are going to drive more of these layoffs. It's a terrible, vicious cycle that we're getting into, and very tragic, I'm afraid, for a lot of people coming into Christmas.
I don't need to tell anyone who gets on a plane these statistics out today, but government figures show that about a third of Qantas, Jetstar and Virgin flights in Australia, these are domestic flights, were late in the month of October. And the big headline, Matt, was that Qantas was the least reliable domestic airline in the country. We're paying through the nose for fares at the moment. Any chance you think that Qantas can rebuild its brand?
Well, it's struggling to at the moment, and it's because, one, that on-time performance, and two, the exorbitant costs of airfares. I would say that it is one of the biggest issues in the city where I live at the moment. Probably behind crime, it is the biggest issue that people in Darwin are dealing with at the moment. People here are paying up to $1,000 each way for a flight to Melbourne or Sydney. There are people in Darwin at the moment who are saying, we can't afford to go home and see our loved ones for Christmas because the cost is just too exorbitant. Something needs to be done about it. And when they then see airlines like Qantas return such massive profits, they just feel like they're getting ripped off blind. You know, the Qantas brand up here at the moment, you know, the NT in Qantas stands for the Northern Territory, but certainly people in the Northern Territory do not feel like Qantas is on their side at the moment.
I tell you, on those numbers, Matt, that's about the cost of a flight to London to get out of Darwin down to Melbourne. I mean, that's just that's unacceptable. Let's go, James, if we can, just quickly. Queensland Public Servants is set, I couldn't believe this one, I read it today, are set to get a one-off cost of living payment come Christmas. The poor old taxpayers won't be getting that relief. They're paying this to the tune of $350 million.
Peter, all I can say is roll on election day in Queensland. I mean, come on, that's just unacceptable. Think about what we've just talked about. A third of companies, private companies, looking at layoffs, and Queensland public sector workers are going to get a bonus. It's beyond a joke. I'm sorry. It's not appropriate. They should hand the money back and show a little bit of the sympathy for the people that they regulate and govern.
And tax. And tax. James Morrow. Matt Cunningham, thank you. Thank you, gents. Let's go to the Middle East now, where Israel's cabinet has approved a ceasefire deal with Hamas for the release of hostages being held in Gaza in exchange for Palestinians in Israeli prisons. Now, under the deal, Hamas is to free 50 of the 240 hostages it's holding over a 4-day period. Joining me now for the latest, the Australian's foreign editor, Greg Sheridan. Greg, take us through this plan and what it means for the wider conflict, because it's, from what I understand, a 4-day ceasefire, so effectively a pause, or is it likely to morph into something else and it's a cessation of the war completely?
Peter, it's great to be with you. Look, this is a dangerous moment for Israel. I think they had to agree to something like this because the sense of solidarity in Israel with the innocent hostages is overwhelming. But these hostage deals actually have been very bad for Israel in the past. You know, they released 1,000 Palestinian prisoners in order to retrieve Corporal Gilad Shalit in 2011. Among them were 280 people on life sentences for murdering Israeli civilians, and among them are the leaders of Hamas today who masterminded the October 7 atrocities. Now, there's going to be a 4-day pause in the fighting. and Hamas will release 12 or 13 prisoners every day. At this stage, only women and children. Israel is determined that for the moment it won't be releasing any Palestinian with blood on their hands directly, but will be releasing female prisoners. Israel has said, though, that it will extend the pause in fighting for a day every time Hamas releases another 10 prisoners. Now, Hamas has been severely degraded and hurt by this military campaign Israel is running, and it has an incentive to string this out for as long as possible. And I think it could well release 10 prisoners a day for some time. It also got Israel to agree to have no drone surveillance over Gaza while this pause in fighting is on. And that is ostensibly is so the Hamas terrorists can go and round up the hostages who may be being held by Palestinian and Islamic Jihad or by public-spirited Gazan citizens who just went over the border to rape and murder and torture and pillage and kidnap when Hamas was doing that on October 7. So this is a very fraught business. If the ceasefire continues, Israel will then come under enormous pressure not to resume its campaign, but 250,000 Israelis are temporarily displaced from their own homes. Israel really has to eliminate Hamas leadership in Gaza if it's to return to any semblance of normal life. So this is a very dangerous and fraught moment.
Greg, what do you make of the announcement late this afternoon from Penny Wong confirming that 860 visas have been approved for Palestinians with connections to Australia between the period of October 7 to November 20? I note a recent study published by the Arab World for Research and Development, and this is last week, that shows that 75% of Arab Palestinians support the Hamas terror attacks on the 7th of October. How confident can we be that we're not importing Hamas terror into this country?
Well, this is a very difficult question, Peter, and I think this government is becoming incredibly ragged in foreign affairs and national security generally, and I've up till now been prepared to give them the benefit of the doubt. But how extensive and reliable are security checks undertaken by Australian authorities in Gaza? Of course, every human being would have compassion for innocent civilians who have suffered in Gaza, and the moral responsibility for their suffering rests entirely with the Hamas terrorist group. And instead of calling on Israel to exercise restraint, the Albanese government might have been calling on Hamas to surrender itself to the International Court of Justice to face war crimes trials for their atrocities on October 7, and to release the hostages, which would make a cessation of fighting much more likely. If these are innocent civilians, it's good that we give them shelter. On the other hand, what recent weeks have revealed is that there is a really terrible tradition of Arab anti-Semitism alive and well, which is mixing in with all the other anti-Semitism, which is resurgent all over the world. And it's not only that the vast majority of Palestinians support the Hamas atrocities, these were really unspeakable atrocities on October 7, but there is a tremendous tradition of anti-Semitism and hatred of Jews throughout the education system in the territories. And then Penny Wong says, but don't worry, we granted 1,700 visas to Israelis, as though somehow or other, that shows a balance. I mean, this
that cancels it
awful
out.
Moral equivalence that this government goes in for all the time now. I think this is becoming a very shabby government in these matters, and I'm no longer willing to give them the benefit of the doubt or to accept anything on trust. Having said all that, any Palestinian who comes in under these visas has absolutely a welcome from Australia. I mean, if they're here and they're obeying the law and all the rest of it, God bless them, and we wish them deliverance from this terrible conflict which has been brought about by Hamas.
Which, of course, they voted for many years ago. Greg Sheridan, thank you. I might also mention too, Home Affairs, that department that's under siege, that'll make the assessments of these people coming to Australia. That's led by Claire O'Neill and Andrew Giles, those two ministers I've spent the top of the show talking about. Well, they still do not have a permanent secretary in charge. Michael Pizzullo, that report will come out, we're told, imminently about whether or not he keeps his job. All right, let's go to a break. After the break, Tony Abbott will join me, man who shirt-fronted Vladimir Putin. We'll discuss Anthony Albanese's response to China's attack on our Navy last week, plus a new report that's found just 10 weeks of classes across a 4-year Bachelor of Education degree are actually dedicated to teaching literacy and numeracy. Welcome back. Coming up, why electric vehicle insurance premiums are skyrocketing in the UK, set to hit Australia too, as more and more of us opt to stick with petrol or diesel cars. But first, the federal government's response to a Chinese warship's deliberate attack on our naval divers last week, which now has our Japanese allies rightly concerned about increasing tensions in our region. Now, as we know, the Prime Minister has refused to disclose whether he confronted Xi Jinping about the incident when they met last week at the APEC summit in San Francisco. He claims you don't deny or confirm this stuff. Now, that's not how other Prime Ministers have handled such difficult issues, including my next guest, former Prime Minister Tony Abbott. Tony, welcome to the program. Thank you for your time. The PM's refusing to give a straight answer here about whether or not he confronted Xi about Chinese naval attacks on our naval divers. If this had happened during your tenure as PM, what would you have done? And do you buy his line that he can't answer questions from the media about this?
Peter, thanks for having me. I think it's almost inconceivable that a Prime Minister speaking to another national leader whose military personnel had harmed our military personnel would not have raised this subject. So I'm confident that our Prime Minister would have raised this with President Xi. And given that he almost certainly has done so, I do think it's a pity that he hasn't told us, because any doubt about whether our Prime Minister is standing up for Australia's national interest with other leaders is quite corrosive, and it should be dispelled as quickly as possible.
Yeah, he doesn't need to say what he said, but surely given, as you say, our divers were injured by their Navy, he's got to put it on the record that he stood up for Australia's national interest, surely. And if he didn't, doesn't that say perhaps you're giving him the benefit of the doubt that I perhaps am not?
Well, that's quite correct, Peter. I mean, I didn't go into chapter and verse of the shirt front discussion I had with President Putin of Russia, but I certainly indicated publicly at the time that it had been a pretty robust conversation, as it should be, because back then a Russian missile had killed almost 40 innocent Australians. Now, thank God in this instance, it's much less objectively serious, but nevertheless, no one should be allowed to harm our people without a strong reaction from Australia, because we are a self-respecting country. We shouldn't be pushed around by anyone, even and perhaps especially a global bully like China under the current government.
Let's go to the calls today from Peter Dutton, wanting to see moral courage and clarity in unequivocally condemning anti-Semitism in Australia. Now, I suspect in part he's pointing at attempts by some in the media and Labor to create some sort of moral equivalence between anti-Semitism, which is rife, and the almost non-existence of Islamophobia. You and others have called the moment that we're living through right now as a civilisational moment. What do you mean by that?
There's a real crisis of self-confidence in countries such as ours. The Anglosphere, which has done so much to lead the world into a better place, is plagued by this self-doubt. And this is why so many people in countries like Australia seem to prefer Hamas, a terrorist death cult, to a liberal democracy such as Israel, which always does its best to try to ensure human decency is recognised and protected. And I think that that night, October the 9th, when you had hundreds of Australians chanting, I shrink even from mentioning what they were chanting, but this was just a shameful moment, an absolutely shameful moment, and a moment of unutterable shame. And we should be doing everything we humanly can to redeem ourselves by making it absolutely crystal clear that in this existential struggle between the Hamas death cult and the only liberal democracy in the Middle East, Israel, we are unequivocally on Israel's side. No ifs, no buts, no false equivalence, no phony invocation of Islamophobia, along with the rampant anti-Semitism that we've seen on our streets and the streets of other Western cities. We are on Israel's side in this struggle.
I've got to ask you about the news late this afternoon. The government has granted over 840 visas to Palestinians. Given what we've seen in recent weeks regarding the Home Affairs Department and the ministers, do you think they're up to the security checks needed before these people land in Australia?
Look, I saw the Foreign Minister assuring people just a few moments ago that all the security checks had been done. But as far as I'm aware, there are no Australian officials whatsoever in Gaza. None. So I just wonder how this could possibly be correct. Who did these security checks? How extensive and how thorough were they, particularly given the polling that we've seen, suggesting that something like 70% of the population of Gaza believed that the October 7 atrocities were entirely justified? Well, we don't want to be importing trouble into our country, and I just hope that the government has been a lot clearer and a lot more thorough about this than it has been on quite a few other things just in the last few weeks.
All right, I've got to leave it there. We've got our latest podcast episode out tomorrow, the last for the year. There's a bit of hope in there, though, for those who are worried about where the world's headed and whether we're just managing our decline. I'll leave it there. Thank you for your time, as always. Tony Abbott. All right, after the break, taxpayers still shelling out millions of dollars for at least 50 Com Games staff 5 months after the Games were cancelled. And the National Anti-Corruption Commission warning we could well have another pink bats scandal. Coming up, as always, on a Wednesday, my dear friend Kel Richards. But first to my panel, John Roscombe from the Institute of Public Affairs, Nick Cater from the Menzies Research Centre. Nick, I want to pick up that report out yesterday to say that no way are they going to make this 2030 target on electric vehicle sales. At best, they're looking at 27% by 2030, not the 89% that Labor forecast prior to the election. And one of the issues is range, big country like ours, big distances we drive. And also a new report out of the UK that's found anyone with an electric car is facing close to a 1,000% increase in insurance premiums. That's because when an EV is involved in a crash, you can't really repair it. The whole car tends to be written off. There's fire risks as well. Ausgrid too has found that 82% of rooftop solar in this country, the installations are non-compliant and unsafe. This is shocking, isn't it?
Well, it is. And look, the last time governments tried to tell you what cars you could buy was in East Germany, when everybody had to drive a Trabant. And look, the electric cars are more advanced than that, obviously, and there's some clever ones coming along, but they're not for everybody, and they're certainly not widely usable on Australian roads, except if you're just pottering around the city. And so this is running into real trouble. I mean, people just don't want to buy them. They're going for other cars. The best-selling car is still, of course, the Hilux. Top five of the top 10 are still utes. You know, they're not going to work, and the government mandating it is not going to change a thing. So but Chris Bowen's going to miss this target. And what's more, you know, even if we get to 30%, 27%, those cars are going to be still being charged largely with coal. by 2030. We won't be at a stage where we're anything like 82% renewable.
I know this is the travesty of it all for those green zealots. John, a new report out from your organisation, the Institute of Public Affairs, they have found that just 10 weeks of classes, 10 weeks only, across the whole 4 years of a Bachelor of Education degree, so less than one semester, is actually dedicated to literacy and numeracy skills so the teacher can teach literacy and numeracy. Now, there's a whole lot of woke stuff in the teaching curriculum. Any wonder our kids are going to try and ditch school tomorrow and march for Palestine? I don't reckon they could even find it on a map, let alone spell it for most of them.
That's right, Peter, and I think there'd be very few parents of school-aged children who are surprised by this report. What we have is university education departments, as identified by Dr. Bella de Brera, who are more interested in pursuing ideologies of race politics, identity politics, climate change alarmism, than actually equipping teachers, A, to impart knowledge, and then B, to control the class. And that is why, despite the very substantial increase in funding that we've seen in Australian schools over the last decade since the so-called Gonski reforms, our standards continue to fall.
The National Anti-Corruption Commission head, Paul Brereton, Nick, we haven't heard a lot from him. We know it started on the 1st of July. He has said that he's going to really look closely, though, at contractors who want to use taxpayer funds as a quick way to make money. We saw all of this, you and I well know, during the pink bats fiasco, but I also think it's a feature of the NDIS too.
Yeah, well, I think you're right, Peter. And look, we know people that just move from one business to the next, whatever the government's subsidising, it'll be in that business, whether it's pink bats, whether it was laying
renewables too, Nick.
Renewables, exactly. That is the safest business to be in, right? Because you've got somebody who you know will pay you from taxpayers' money. I agree with you. I have some personal experience through a family member of NDIS, and I can see the wastage. Everybody involved in the sector, by the way, knows this. It's the dirty little secret that nobody in the sector really wants to talk about. And this has to be reined in. We can't get to a situation where it's costing us $100 billion a year. What's that, about twice as much as we spend on hospitals, for instance? It is not feasible to do that. And I don't think the government's trying to do something around autism, but I think it's just tinkering around the edges as far as I can see looking at the system.
Yeah, it's double Medicare. It'll be about the same as defence, and it's just not sustainable. Let's go to Victoria. John, Victorian taxpayers are still shelling out millions, even though we're 5 months on from the Com Games being scrapped. All of these staff, as I understand today, will continue to be paid for months and months and months. They're calling it gardening leave. It's a joke.
Well, this is the condition of Victoria at the moment. And if you're Victoria, you're seeing what is happening under a Labor government. And this is yet another example of the waste and mismanagement that we're suffering from here in Melbourne. And that explains why a day ago we discovered that the living standards of Victorians have fallen faster and further than those living in any other state. If you are suffering under a Labor government, you are losing here in Victoria, and this is yet another example of what we're experiencing.
But, mate, it's not going to change unless those Liberals lift their game and give people something to vote for. Before we go, Nick, news from Hollywood. The star Susan Sarandon has been dropped by her agency after she said frightened Jews are, quote, getting a taste of how it feels to be a Muslim in America at a big pro-Palestinian protest in New York. I mean, this is shocking.
I found that particular outburst particularly shocking. You expect a little bit better from people in the public eye like that. But it just shows, doesn't it, how far, Peter, this delusion has gone, and people have opted just for this easy cartoon narrative. Palestinians good, Israeli is bad. Palestinians oppressed, Israelis oppressors. I mean, this is just a travesty of what is actually occurring if you've read the history, if you look what's happening now. But people just want to take these shortcuts now, and I'm very, very disappointed in Susan Sarandon.
And if you're watching at home, I hope it's not your grandchildren or children striking tomorrow in Victoria, marching for a pro-Palestinian world. All right, after the break. Thank you, gentlemen. Catch you both next week. After the break, Kel Richards, as always, on a Wednesday. Well, it's Wednesday. That means I'm joined by my good mate, Credlin regular, wordsmith and broadcaster, Kel Richards. Well, thank you for your time, as always. Always good words that you suggested today. This one, I think, particularly has been raised on Talkback Radio, and good to get your take on it. Give us a sense of the history and the usage of the term anti-Semitism, Kel.
Anti-Semitism is recorded in English from 1880, but a few years earlier it turned up in German, coined by a man named Wilhelm Marr, who was anti-Semitic himself and wrote anti-Semitic articles and pamphlets. The word Semite itself refers to any of the people in Genesis chapter 10 who are the descendants of one of the sons of Noah, a man named Shem. They are Semites. The anti is put in front of it to mean antagonistic. So anti-Semitism is antagonism to Jewish people. It's hatred and disparagement of Jewish people. And it's been, as I say, as a word since 1880, but it's been around much longer than the word has been around. Oh, interestingly, can I just add?
And so is the behaviour, as you know, the pogroms over time, over history, hundreds and hundreds of years. Sorry,
Can I just, this is interesting. A reader of the Oswords website that I run, who's lived in Germany, said in Germany they don't use anti-Semitism anymore. They think it's too vague. They now use the term Jew hatred because they think that's a blunter and more honest expression. Now, that's interesting, isn't it?
And that is something I've used a little bit here too as well, because I think you've got to call it out as it is. And not a lot of people, as I mentioned, that talkback conversation, I think not a lot of people are confident about the term anti-Semitism. Another query from one of our listeners, Leslie, she wants you to explain the origins of the expression Zionism.
Well, Zion is the ancient biblical name for the site where Jerusalem stands, on Mount Zion. It was turned into Zionism as a political movement by a man named Theodor Herzl, 1897. And it was in those days a movement seeking to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Since the United Nations established Israel in 1947, it has been the general movement, the political movement, to defend and take care of, protect the Jewish homeland, which is what Israel is. So that's what Zionism is about. It's about saying the Jews are the indigenous people of that part of the world and they need a homeland there.
I hope people who are ignorant just heard that, because it is the return of Jews and not the establishment of Jews in their original homeland. They were drummed out over thousands of years. Some remained, not many, and it was bringing them back. Because this idea that they shouldn't be there because they were never there, we've got to put that one to bed. Christopher wants to know, what's the origin of the expression beside yourself? I use it a lot. I've got no idea. Cal, what can you tell us?
Okay. Well, it's very old. It turns up in William Caxton was the first man to do printing in England. And in 1490, it turns up in one of his translations. It basically means an overflow of emotion. And the idea is that all of your emotions pour out of you and basically sit beside you like a second self. So there's me and there's all of my emotions as well. I'm beside myself.
I love it. I love it. As I said, I use it all the time. Now I know what it actually means. Hey, Brent, another one of our viewers, wants to know, what's the origin? I probably could guess this one, but let's get it from the expert. What's the origin of bucket list?
Look, you will have guessed it. It does come from the 2007 movie, the idea of the list of things you'll do before you kick the bucket. So we can tell you who came up with it. There's a Hollywood screenwriter named Justin Zachman. He wrote the script for the movie, so I think I can say with a fair amount of confidence, Justin Zachman was the man who came up with bucket list. And it's very rare that one person comes up with an expression that takes off in the English language, but Justin's done it. Bucket list is now part of our conversation in English.
Come on. I reckon it goes back way before that. You'd often say, what's on your bucket list? Yes. Well, yeah, I don't buy it was just in recent time.
I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying so far the Oxford English Dictionary, who look for citations going back, have not found any before the movie. Yeah. So it may have been around as part of conversational English and not recorded. That's possible. But there may be in some obscure newspaper or magazine or article somewhere a citation saying bucket list which has been missed. So if you've come across that, please let me know. I'll pass it on to Oxford.
You are challenging our viewers because they will go to ground now and try and find you something to come back with next week. Where can people go, Kel? Where can people go for more words for next week?
Ozwords, ozwords.com.au.
All right, there he is. Isn't he wonderful? Kel Richards, send your words into ozwords.com.au. Thanks for your company, everyone. See you tomorrow night. Here is Andrew Bolt.